The morning my son let his wife say, "This isn't a charity," I was still holding a warm apple pie in both hands. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't look away. She said it loud enough for the cashier to stop scanning for the man at the counter, to turn his head for every employee in that store to hear exactly where I stood. "This isn't a charity, Linda." For a second, I thought I misheard her. I had been coming into that store for nearly 30 years. Longer than some of those shelves had been standing, longer than most of the people working there had been alive. I used to know every corner, every creak in the floor, every regular customer by name. Now I was standing there like I didn't belong. I glanced at my son. Eric didn't look at me right away. He was staring at the invoice in his hand like it had suddenly become the most important thing in the world. When he finally did speak, it wasn't to defend me. Mom just let Nicole handle it. That was it. No hesitation, no pause, no second thought. Just let her handle it! The pie started to feel heavier in my hands. I had walked in that morning the same way I always did. Quiet, unannounced. Not because I had to, because I wanted to, because that place used to feel like home. I'd baked the pie before sunrise, out of habit more than anything. It's what I used to do when Eric was younger, when he still asked me questions, when he still listened. Nicole had been flipping through a stack of invoices when I stepped behind the counter. I didn't interrupt. I waited. That's something you learn after running a business for decades. You don't jump in unless you're needed. But I noticed the numbers. One supplier. Same product. Double the usual cost. I leaned in just a little and said soft enough that it should have stayed between us. "You might want to double check that one. That looks higher than what we usually pay." She didn't check it. She didn't even look down. She snapped the folder shut like I had just insulted her. "Oh my God," she said, shaking her head loud and sharp. "Are you seriously questioning how we run things now?" I kept my voice calm. "I'm not questioning, I'm just pointing out." She cut me off. "You don't even understand how this business works anymore." That line landed harder than it should have, because I did understand. I understood how it started, how it survived years when we barely made rent, how we kept customers coming back when big box stores moved in down the road. I understood what it cost: time, sleep, everything. But she wasn't done. "Do you have any idea how much we've had to change to keep this place running?" She continued, arms crossed, voice rising just enough to carry. "This isn't the 90s anymore. We're not running a mom and pop out of a garage." There were people listening now. I could feel it without turning my head. Eric shifted beside her, but he didn't step in. He didn't say, "That's enough." He didn't say, "She built this place." He just stood there quiet, like staying neutral somehow meant staying out of it. Then she said it. "This isn't a charity, Linda." And just like that, everything in that room changed. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they meant. It meant I wasn't helping. It meant I wasn't wanted. It meant I was extra, a burden. She waved her hand toward the counter like she was brushing something off. "We don't need you coming in here with food and opinions. If you're not working, you're just in the way." Someone behind me shifted. A chair scraped lightly against the floor. No one spoke. I looked at Eric again. This time he met my eyes for half a second, and then he looked away. That was the moment that stayed with me. Not her voice, not the words. I set the pie down on the edge of the counter. No one reached for it. No one said thank you. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them whose name was still on the paperwork, whose signature still opened the accounts, whose years were built into every inch of that place. I just nodded once like I understood something they hadn't said out loud. Then I turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang the same way it always had. Bright, familiar, unchanged. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have for that time of year. I stood there for a second, just long enough to realize something simple. I hadn't been pushed out that morning. I had already been replaced. And somehow I had let it happen. The cold air stayed with me longer than it should have, even after I got back into my car. I sat there with the engine running, hands still resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. For a moment I thought about going back inside. Not to argue, just to fix it. Smooth it over. Say something light so it didn't feel so heavy. That's what I used to do. Keep things moving, keep people comfortable, keep the peace. But I didn't open the door. Instead, I turned the key and pulled out of the lot slowly, the storefront shrinking in the rear view mirror like it belonged to someone else. It hadn't always felt that way. There was a time when that place was the center of everything. My husband Daniel and I started Harper Home Supply with a folding table and a borrowed truck. Saturdays at flea markets. Sundays organizing inventory on the living room floor. We didn't have investors. We didn't have a plan beyond the next month. What we had was consistency. We showed up, we listened to customers, we learned what people needed before they asked for it. By the time we opened our first small storefront, we knew every product on those shelves because we had carried half of them in by hand. There were years we barely broke even, years when we skipped vacations, skipped upgrades, skipped anything that didn't keep the doors open. But it grew, slowly, honestly. And when Daniel passed, I didn't even consider selling. I kept it going because it was still ours, because it still meant something. Eric was in his early 20s then, trying to find his way. He'd bounce between ideas, tech startups, online businesses, things that sounded impressive but never quite landed. When he asked if he could come work at the store, I didn't hesitate. I thought he was coming home. At first it felt like he had. He was good with people, better than I was, if I'm being honest. Customers liked him. He picked things up quickly. He had ideas about inventory systems, online orders, things I didn't fully understand but didn't need to. I trusted him. That trust is what made it easy to step back. It didn't happen all at once. I didn't just hand over the keys and walk away. It was gradual. First, I stopped opening the store in the mornings. Then I stopped handling supplier calls. Then I started coming in only a few times a week. Then once a week. Then whenever I felt like it. The structure stayed the same. My name was still on the paperwork. The main account was still under my control. But day-to-day decisions, those became Eric's. And for a while, that worked. Until Nicole came into the picture. I remember the first time I met her, she was confident, polished, the kind of person who knew exactly how she wanted to be seen. She asked a lot of questions about the business, not in a curious way, but in a measuring way. Like she was trying to figure out what needed to change. At the time, I thought that was a good thing. Fresh perspective, energy, ambition. It didn't take long for things to start shifting. Small changes at first. Suppliers we had worked with for years suddenly replaced with more competitive options. Products reordered in different quantities. Systems updated. Processes streamlined. None of it was wrong on its own. That's what made it hard to push back. But then came the decisions that didn't sit right. Holiday bonuses reduced. Longtime employees having their hours cut. A delivery driver we'd worked with for over a decade quietly dropped without explanation. When I asked about it, Nicole always had an answer. Margins are tighter now. We have to think bigger. This is how modern businesses survive. And Eric would stand beside her nodding. Not aggressively, not dismissively, just agreeing. That's the part that took me longer to understand. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He just wasn't choosing me. There's a difference. I started noticing how conversations changed when I walked into the room. How decisions had already been made before I was told about them, how my suggestions were acknowledged but never really considered. It wasn't open conflict. It was something quieter, a slow shift in position. I told myself it was natural, that this is what stepping back looks like, that I couldn't expect things to stay the same forever, and maybe that was true. But there's a line between change and erasure, and somewhere along the way that line had been crossed. I just hadn't said anything. Because every time I thought about pushing back, I'd hear Eric's voice in my head. This is how business works now. Like what I had built didn't apply anymore. Like experience had an expiration date. So I adjusted. I visited less. I asked fewer questions. I let them run things their way. And in doing that, I made it easier for them to forget what my place had been to begin with. Sitting in my kitchen later that afternoon, the house quiet around me, I realized something I hadn't been willing to admit before. Nothing that happened that morning had come out of nowhere. It had been building. In the decisions I didn't challenge, in the conversations I stepped out of, in the moments I chose not to make things uncomfortable. I had told myself I was being supportive, that I was giving them space, that I was doing the right thing by letting go. But the truth felt a little different now. I hadn't lost my place in that business. I had slowly stepped out of it piece by piece until there was nothing left for anyone to defend. The stack of unopened bank statements was still sitting in the drawer where I had been putting them for months. I pulled them out one by one, the paper slightly curled at the edges, still sealed the way they arrived. For years, I never worried about them. I'd glance at the totals check for anything obvious and move on. That had been enough when I knew exactly how the business was being run. Now I wasn't so sure. I sat down at the kitchen table, slid on my reading glasses, and opened the most recent one. At first glance, nothing looked alarming. Deposits were there, expenses were there, payroll, utilities, vendor payments, it all followed the same general pattern I'd seen for years. But something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't one number, it was the way the numbers lined up. I flipped back to the previous month, then the one before that. That feeling stayed. The expenses had gone up. Not dramatically. Not enough to raise immediate concern, just enough to make things feel tighter than they should have been. I picked up a pen and started marking entries. Same vendor appearing more frequently than before. Same category labeled consulting showing up every week. Round numbers, clean numbers. That's what caught my attention. Business expenses are rarely that neat. I circled one of the entries, then another. Every Thursday. Same amount. No attached invoice in the records I had. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the page. That wasn't how we used to operate. We tracked everything. Every shipment, every adjustment, every return. If something went out, there was always a trail. I opened another statement. There it was again. Thursday. Same amount. Different description, but the pattern held. That's when it stopped feeling like a coincidence. I got up, walked over to the filing cabinet in the hallway, and pulled open the drawer where I kept older records. The metal scraped softly as I shifted through folders labeled by year. I found the ones from 2 years ago, before Nicole, before most of the changes. I laid them side by side on the table. Back then, expenses fluctuated. Some weeks were heavier, some lighter. Vendor names were consistent. Descriptions were detailed. There were no repeating patterns like this. No weekly withdrawals that didn't clearly connect to inventory or payroll. I went back to the current statements. Thursday, every time. I wrote the dates down in a straight column on a notepad. Then I added the amounts. It wasn't a huge number on its own, not something that would set off alarms immediately, but over time it added up. Enough to matter, enough to notice. I tapped the pen against the paper, thinking. There were only a few ways money could leave the business like that. Either it was being moved intentionally or it wasn't being tracked properly. And I knew one thing for certain. We didn't suddenly forget how to keep records. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for First Prairie Bank. I didn't call yet, not because I didn't want answers, but because I didn't have the right questions. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into the account. My name was still there, primary account holder. That hadn't changed. The login went through without issue. The dashboard loaded, and I started clicking through transaction histories going further back than the statements in front of me. The same pattern appeared. Week after week, different labels, same behavior. I clicked on one of the entries to see more detail. Minimal description. No attached documentation. Just enough information to look legitimate. Not enough to explain anything. I checked the vendor name listed. It wasn't one I recognized. That didn't automatically mean anything. Businesses change suppliers all the time. But I had a memory for names. After decades of working with the same people, you remember who's been reliable, who delivers on time, who you can call when something goes wrong. This name didn't belong to that list. I opened a new tab and searched for it. A website came up. Clean, simple, generic. No real detail, no history, no clear connection to the type of products we sold. I clicked through a few pages. Nothing that tied it directly to hardware supply. That didn't prove anything, but it didn't reassure me either. I went back to the account and checked another vendor. Same thing. A business that existed on paper. Not much beyond that. I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. It would have been easy to dismiss it, to assume it was just part of the changes I hadn't kept up with, to tell myself that this is what modernizing looked like. But something inside me didn't accept that, because no matter how much things change, certain principles don't. You don't pay for things you can't explain. You don't move money without a clear purpose. And you don't ignore patterns that repeat themselves that cleanly. I closed the laptop halfway and rested my hands on it. For the first time since that morning in the store, the feeling wasn't just hurt. It was something else, something sharper, more focused. If this was just a difference in how they ran things, I would have found a way to understand it. But this didn't look like a difference. It looked like something being hidden. I opened the laptop again and started writing down every vendor name that didn't feel familiar. One by one, slowly, carefully. Not because I was trying to prove anything yet, just because I wanted to see how far it went. And as the list grew, so did the space between what I thought was happening in that business and what actually was. I circled the last name on the list and set the pen down. There were more unfamiliar vendors than I was comfortable with. Not dozens, not enough to scream fraud, but enough to form a pattern, enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the clock on the wall. Just past 2 p.m. The store would still be open. For a moment, I thought about driving back, walking in, asking directly, putting the statements on the counter and letting them explain. But I already knew how that would go. Nicole would take over the conversation. Eric would stay quiet, and somehow I would end up being the one who didn't understand. So I stayed where I was. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed the number listed under one of the vendors. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. No company greeting, no business name, just a generic message. Leave your message. I didn't. I hung up and tried the next one. This time someone answered. Hello. I kept my tone neutral. Hi, I'm calling to confirm an order history for Harper Home Supply. Can you tell me what products you've been supplying us? There was a pause. I'm not sure I have that information in front of me. Can you check? Another pause. Can I call you back? That wasn't how real vendors responded. The people we had worked with for years could tell you our order history off the top of their head. They knew our seasonal patterns, our preferred brands, even which items we reordered more often in the winter. This didn't sound like that. It's fine, I said. Thank you. I ended the call. I didn't need more from that conversation. I needed context. I turned back to my laptop and pulled up the internal sales reports, something I still had access to through the system Eric had set up. I didn't use it often, but my login had never been removed. The dashboard loaded slowly. I clicked into inventory flow, then vendor mapping. I cross-referenced the unfamiliar names from my list with the products we were supposedly receiving from them. That's when things started to line up in a way I didn't expect. The items attached to those vendors weren't new. They were the same products we had always carried. Same brands, same categories. But the suppliers listed had changed, and the prices attached to those entries were higher than what I remembered. Not dramatically higher, just enough. I clicked deeper into one of the entries and pulled up the historical comparison. 2 years ago, we were sourcing that item from a supplier in Des Moines. Now it was coming from a company I had never heard of, at a higher price. I checked another. Same pattern, different product, different vendor, same result. I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not anger, recognition. This wasn't random. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. This was structured. I picked up the phone again and called one of our old suppliers. Midwest Hardware Distribution. The voice on the other end was familiar. Hey, this is Linda Harper. There was a brief pause, then warmth. Linda, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything all right? I just had a quick question, I said. Are you still supplying to Harper Home Supply? Another pause. No, we haven't had an order from you folks in months. Thought maybe you switched vendors. We did, I said. Do you remember what you were charging us for the standard utility line? Same as always. We kept your pricing steady. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I looked back at the numbers on my screen. We hadn't just switched vendors. We had switched to more expensive ones, without changing the product. That alone didn't prove anything illegal. Businesses do that sometimes, but they don't usually do it quietly. And they don't usually do it across multiple categories at the same time. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the quiet street. If this was just a bad decision, it would show up differently. Margins would drop. Inventory would shift. But the sales reports didn't reflect that kind of imbalance, which meant the difference had to be going somewhere else. I turned back to the table and picked up my list again. There was only one way to make sense of it. The vendors weren't just vendors. They were part of something, a layer, a middle step between the business and where the money ended up. I didn't have proof of that yet, but I didn't need proof to recognize the shape of it. I sat back down and opened a new document. I started organizing everything. Dates, amounts, vendor names, product categories. I built it the same way I used to build inventory systems, slow, methodical, making sure every piece connected before moving on to the next. Because if I was right about this, I couldn't afford to be vague. And if I was wrong, I needed to know that too. The sun had started to dip by the time I finished the first pass. The kitchen was quiet again. The same quiet I'd been sitting in earlier, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Earlier, it had felt like something had been taken from me. Now it felt like something had been uncovered. I looked down at the document on my screen, at the patterns I couldn't unsee, at the names that didn't belong. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what had been said to me that morning. I was thinking about what had been done while I wasn't looking. I closed the laptop, slowly, careful not to rush the motion like speed would somehow change what I had just seen. It didn't. The numbers stayed the same whether I looked at them quickly or slowly. I stood there for a moment, hands resting on the edge of the table, letting the weight of it settle in the only way it could, quietly. If this had happened years ago, I would have driven straight back to the store. I would have put everything on the counter and asked for an explanation. Not aggressively, not angrily, just directly. That had always worked before, but things weren't the same anymore. And more importantly, neither was I. I walked over to the sink, rinsed out the mug I hadn't realized I'd been holding all afternoon, and set it in the rack. The routine of it gave me a second to think clearly. Because this wasn't just about being right. It was about being precise. If I said something too early, they would adjust. If I showed my hand too soon, they would explain it away. Or worse, they would fix just enough to make it look clean again. And I would be left with suspicion instead of proof. So I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't go back. Instead, I picked up my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't used in a long time. Denise Caldwell. She had come into the store years ago, always carrying a leather folder, always asking very specific questions about filing systems and record keeping. Back then, she was a junior attorney, sharp, observant, the kind of person who didn't miss details. Now she had her own practice. I pressed call. She answered on the third ring. Caldwell Law. Denise, it's Linda Harper. There was a pause, then recognition. Linda from Harper Home Supply. That's right. Her tone shifted slightly warmer. It's been a while. What can I help you with? I didn't explain everything. Not yet. I just need to understand my position, I said. Legally, another pause. What kind of situation are we talking about? The kind where I still own something, but I haven't been the one running it. That was enough. Can you come by tomorrow? She asked. I can. Her office hadn't changed much. Same quiet space, same organized desk, same way of looking at you like she was already processing 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. I laid the documents in front of her. Not everything. Just enough. Ownership structure, account access, a few highlighted transactions. She didn't interrupt while I spoke. She didn't rush me either. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, fingers steepled for a moment before she said anything. You're still listed as the primary managing member on the LLC, she said. I am. And the main operating account in my name. She nodded once. That matters. I watched her closely. How much does it matter? She gave a small, measured answer. It means you haven't lost control. You've just chosen not to use it. That landed exactly where it needed to. I let out a slow breath. And if I decide to use it now, Denise leaned forward slightly. Then you need to be very careful about how you do it. She turned one of the documents toward me, tapping lightly on a section. If there's mismanagement, you can intervene. If there's financial misconduct, you can go further. But you need documentation, clear documentation. I've started putting that together. Good, she said, because once you act, you won't be able to take it back. And if they push back legally, you need to be able to show exactly why you did what you did. I nodded. I'm not interested in a fight, I said. Denise's expression didn't change. That's not something you get to control once money is involved. That was fair. She continued, her tone steady. You have options. But timing is everything. If you move too early, they'll have time to adjust. If you move too late, you risk losing more than you need to. I looked down at the papers. The dates, the patterns, the names. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything I can't prove, I said. Then don't accuse, she replied. Verify. That word stayed with me. Verify. Not assume. Not confront. Confirm. She outlined the steps in a way that made sense. Confirm transaction sources. Match vendors to actual services. Document inconsistencies. Secure your position before making any changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing aggressive. Just controlled. When I left her office, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. The kind of clear that doesn't come from emotion, but from understanding exactly where you stand. Back home, I spread everything out again. This time with structure. I created folders, printed records, labeled timelines. Every transaction that didn't make sense went into one place. Every vendor that couldn't be verified went into another. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't trying to catch them in the act. I was building something solid enough that it didn't matter how they responded. Because once I moved, I wasn't going to explain myself. I was going to act. And that required something I hadn't needed in a long time. Patience. Real patience. Not the kind where you wait for things to get better. The kind where you wait until there's nothing left to question. I sat down at the table again, pen in hand, and added another entry to the list. Date. Amount. Vendor. No assumptions, just facts. Because whatever this was, it wasn't going to fall apart on its own. And I wasn't going to give them a chance to put it back together once I saw it clearly. The confirmation email from the bank came through just after 8:12 a.m. I read it once, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I hadn't missed anything. Every line was clear, every step verified. My name still listed exactly where it had always been. Primary account holder, authorized control intact. Nothing had been taken from me. I had just stopped using it. I closed the email and set the phone down on the table. There was no rush in what I did next. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down, looked through the folder one more time, not searching for new information, just confirming that everything I needed was already there. Dates aligned, transactions documented, vendor inconsistencies mapped. Nothing left vague. That mattered, because once I moved, it wouldn't be about what I believed. It would be about what I could show. I picked up the phone again and dialed First Prairie Bank. "Good morning, this is Martin." His voice hadn't changed. "Martin, it's Linda Harper." A brief pause, then recognition. "Linda, what can I do for you?" "I need to make some changes to the operating account." There was a shift in his tone. Professional, focused. "Go ahead." "I want to transfer the full available balance into a secured account under my name." Silence for half a second. Then carefully, "You're authorized to do that." "I know." Another pause. "Do you want to proceed now?" "Yes." He didn't ask why. He didn't question the decision. That's something people misunderstand about authority. When it's clearly documented, it doesn't need explanation. "All right," he said, "I'll initiate the transfer. You'll receive confirmation shortly." "Thank you." I ended the call. No shaking hands. No hesitation. Just done. A few minutes later, the notification came through. "Transfer complete." I stared at the screen for a moment, not reacting right away. There wasn't a rush of satisfaction. There wasn't anger, just a quiet shift. Like something that had been slightly out of place had finally been set back where it belonged. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out across the street. The world looked the same. Cars passing, a neighbor walking their dog. Nothing about the outside had changed, but inside that business, everything had. I went back to the table and picked up the second document Denise had helped prepare. Authorization update. It was simple, direct. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It didn't explain. It didn't argue. It just adjusted access. I signed it, scanned it, and sent it over. Eric's operational authority on the account was now restricted. Not removed completely, just enough to stop movement, enough to make sure that nothing left that account without going through me. Again, the email sent. No message attached. No warning. No explanation. I didn't call Eric. I didn't call Nicole. There was nothing to say, because this wasn't a conversation. This was a correction. The next step was even simpler. I opened a new email and attached the audit request Denise had drafted. Subject line: request for independent financial review. No accusations, no emotion, just documentation. A formal request to review transactions over the past 6 months. Sent to the business email, sent to Eric, sent to Nicole, and sent to the accounting service they had switched to earlier that year. I read it once before clicking send. Clean, precise, unavoidable. Then I clicked. The email left, and with it, any version of the situation that could still be handled casually. I sat back in the chair and let the silence settle around me. The kind of silence that doesn't come from absence, but from completion. I didn't check my phone right away. I didn't wait for a reaction. Because reactions weren't the point. Structure was. For weeks, I had been looking at fragments, numbers that didn't align, names that didn't belong, patterns that suggested something deeper. Now everything was in place. Not exposed yet, but positioned. The difference matters, because exposure creates chaos. Positioning creates control. I picked up my coffee again, now lukewarm, and took a sip. It didn't taste the same. Not worse, just different. Like something had shifted slightly out of habit. My phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it. Nicole. I let it ring. It stopped. Then again, same name, same urgency. I didn't answer. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I didn't need to hear what I already understood. A third call, then silence. A message came through. "What did you do?" I looked at the words for a moment. There it was. Not confusion. Not concern. Recognition. I set the phone back down without replying. A few minutes later, another message. "The account isn't processing payments." I leaned back slightly in the chair, eyes still on the screen. That didn't surprise me. That was the point. Not to break anything, just to stop it from moving the way it had been. Because whatever had been happening, it depended on that movement, on that flow. And without it, everything would have to slow down, be looked at, be explained. I didn't feel the need to respond. There was nothing in those messages that required it. Everything that needed to be said had already been documented. Authorized, Sent. I picked up the folder again and closed it carefully, aligning the edges before setting it aside. For the first time since that morning in the store, I wasn't thinking about what had been said to me. I was thinking about how quickly things change when the right person decides to stop staying out of it. The first call from a supplier came later that afternoon. I recognized the number before I even picked up. Linda, this is Greg from Midwest Hardware. We just tried processing the last invoice and it didn't go through. Everything all right on your end? His voice wasn't accusing, just confused, professional. I kept my tone steady. There's a review happening on the account. Payments are temporarily on hold. A pause. That going to affect future orders? It might, I said. For now, I'd hold off on sending anything new until things are cleared. He didn't push. All right, just let us know. That was the first one. By the next morning, there were 3 more. Different vendors. Same question. Same confusion. By the end of the second day, the calls weren't just questions anymore. They were concerns. The kind that come when people start realizing something isn't moving the way it's supposed to. I didn't answer all of them. Only the ones that mattered. The ones I had worked with for years. The ones who knew the difference between a delay and a disruption. Inside the store, things started shifting faster. I didn't need to be there to see it. I could hear it in the messages. Nicole's text went from sharp to urgent. We have orders backed up. This is affecting inventory. You need to fix this. I didn't respond. Not because I was ignoring her, because there was nothing to fix. The system wasn't broken. It was paused, exactly the way it needed to be. By the third day, the tone changed. The messages weren't about logistics anymore. They were about pressure. Employees are asking about payroll. We can't keep delaying payments like this. I read each one, set the phone down, and went back to what I was doing. Because for years I'd handled those same concerns. I knew what they sounded like. I knew how quickly they grew. And I knew something else. None of those problems had started this week. They had just become visible. That's the part most people don't understand. Things don't fall apart overnight. They just stop being covered. On the 4th day, Eric came to the house. I heard his car before I saw him. The engine cut. The door closed. His footsteps slower than I remembered. I didn't rush to answer. I opened the door before he knocked. He stood there for a second like he wasn't sure what to say. Mom, he started, then stopped. I stepped back slightly, giving him space to come in. He walked inside, looking around like the house had changed somehow. It hadn't. He had. We need to talk, he said. I nodded once. He didn't sit right away. He stayed standing near the edge of the room, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight slightly. The account, something's wrong, he said. No, I replied calmly. There isn't. He looked at me confused. Payments aren't going through. Vendors are calling. We're behind on shipments. I know. That threw him off. Yes. There was a pause. A longer one this time. Then why aren't you fixing it? He asked. I held his gaze. Because there's nothing to fix. The words didn't land the way he expected. He frowned slightly. That doesn't make sense. It does, I said. You're just seeing it from the wrong side. His voice tightened. Mom, we're trying to run a business. You are, I agreed. That's exactly what you're trying to do. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration starting to show. We've been working on this for years. Expanding, updating systems, bringing in new suppliers. I know, I said. You don't understand how much work we've put into this. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish. Because I had heard that sentence before, just in different forms, from different people, at different times. When he finally stopped, I spoke. You've been working, I said. I'm not questioning that. Then what is this? He asked, gesturing slightly like the answer was sitting somewhere in the room. This, I said quietly, is what happens when the structure behind the work isn't solid. He stared at me, not angry. Not yet, just trying to process. We were trying to grow it, he said. There it was. The justification, the reasoning, the belief that intention could replace foundation. I nodded slightly. I know you were. He waited for more, for agreement, for support, but I didn't give him that. Instead, I said something else. You were spending what you didn't build. The room went still. That sentence didn't raise my voice. It didn't accuse him directly, but it landed in a way that didn't leave much room to move around it. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to explain, like he wanted to find a way to shift it into something that made more sense to him. But the words didn't come. Because somewhere in that moment, he understood exactly what I meant. Not all of it, but enough. He sat down finally, slower this time, like the energy had shifted out of him. They're saying we might lose suppliers, he said, quieter now. That's possible. And payroll. I know. He nodded once more to himself than to me. The conversation didn't get louder after that. It got quieter, more careful, like he was choosing each word instead of reacting to them. And for the first time since that morning in the store, he wasn't standing next to someone else. He was standing on his own, trying to figure out where that left him. He didn't argue after that. Not because he agreed, but because he didn't have anything solid enough to stand on. I watched him sit there, shoulders slightly forward, hands loosely clasped, like he was trying to hold on to something that had already shifted out of place. "I didn't know," he said finally. His voice was quieter than before, not defensive, not sharp, just uncertain. I didn't respond right away, because that sentence "I didn't know" can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it means you truly didn't see it. Sometimes it means you chose not to look. And sometimes it means you're only realizing now because it's affecting you. I sat across from him steady. "You signed off on the payments," I said. He nodded slowly. "Nicole handled most of that. I trusted her." "I know you did. That wasn't the issue. Trust isn't the problem. Blind trust is." He looked down at his hands. We thought we were fixing things, making it better. I believe you thought that was the truth. Because people don't usually start by trying to destroy something. They start by trying to improve it. But improvement without understanding doesn't hold. He leaned back, slightly exhaling, like something inside him had finally given way. "What happens now?" he asked. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a challenge. It was a question. The kind you ask when you're no longer in control of the answer. I stood up and walked over to the desk. The folder was still there, organized, labeled, every piece exactly where it needed to be. I opened it, pulled out a single document, and placed it on the table in front of him. He didn't touch it at first. He just looked at it. The header was clear. Transfer of ownership agreement. "This is already in motion," I said. He glanced up at me, confusion returning for a moment. "You're selling it." "I am." "To who?" "Someone who understands what it takes to keep it standing." He stared at the page again, like reading it slower might change what it said. "And us?" he asked. I didn't soften it. "You're not part of it anymore." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. He swallowed, eyes still on the paper. "That's it," he said. "After everything." I held his gaze. "After everything," I repeated. Because that's what it was. Not just that morning, not just the numbers, not just the decisions. Everything, all of it together. "You built this," he said, like he was trying to understand something that didn't match what he was seeing. "Yeah." "And you're just letting it go." I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "I'm deciding where it goes." There's a difference. A big one. Letting go is passive. Deciding is control. He sat there a while longer, the paper still untouched. Then he pushed it back toward me slightly, not aggressively, just enough to show he wasn't ready to accept it. I didn't push it back. I didn't need to, because acceptance wasn't required for it to move forward. Eventually he stood, slower than when he had walked in, less certain, less anchored. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. "I believe that too. Most people don't see the ending when they're in the middle of something. They only see the direction they want it to go." "I didn't think it would either," I replied. That was the last thing I said to him before he walked out. The house felt different after that. Not quieter, just clearer, like something that had been sitting in the background for a long time had finally been brought into focus. The next few weeks moved steadily, not quickly. Nothing about it felt rushed. The paperwork went through the way it was supposed to. The transfer finalized. Tom Granger took over operations. He didn't change much at first. That's how I knew I had chosen the right person. People who understand something don't rush to remake it. They take the time to see what's already working. The store stayed open. Employees who wanted to stay stayed. The ones who had left slowly came back. Not all of them, but enough. I didn't go back inside. I didn't need to. Some things don't require revisiting to be complete. I heard updates from time to time, from people who still recognized me at the grocery store, from suppliers who called just to say things were steady again. Nothing dramatic, just stable. As for Nicole, I heard less. Not because nothing happened, because it didn't need to be loud. Financial reviews have a way of catching up with patterns, quietly, systematically. And Eric, I saw him once, a few weeks later, across the parking lot of a hardware store that wasn't ours. He looked like he was still figuring things out. Not broken, not ruined, just different. Like someone who had learned something he couldn't unlearn. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. These days, my mornings are slower. I still wake up early. Old habits don't leave easily. I make coffee. Sit by the window. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I don't. The house holds a kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. Every now and then someone asks me if I regret it. Selling the business, stepping away, walking out that morning without saying a word. I always give them the same answer. I didn't walk away, I say. I just stopped holding on to something that wasn't being respected. Because that's what it comes down to. Not the money, not the business, not even the betrayal. Just that. Respect. And the moment you realize it's gone, you have a choice. You can stay where you are and pretend nothing changed. Or you can do something about it. Quietly, without arguing, without asking for permission. Just deciding. And once you decide, everything else has a way of following. The truth is, most people think stories like this are about revenge. They're not. They're about the moment you realize where you actually stand and what you're willing to accept from the people closest to you. In a lot of family revenge stories, the focus is always on the payoff, the moment everything turns around. But that's not where the real change happens. It happens earlier, quietly, when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop asking to be included, when you stop shrinking just to keep things comfortable. That's where it begins. Family drama doesn't always look like shouting or broken relationships. Sometimes it looks like silence, like being slowly pushed to the side while everyone pretends nothing has changed. And if you're not paying attention, you can stay in that place longer than you should. What this taught me more than anything is that respect isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It has to be recognized. And when it's not, you don't fight for it by arguing louder. You protect it by stepping back and deciding what you're no longer willing to tolerate. Not every situation needs a confrontation. Not every betrayal needs a scene. Some of the strongest revenge stories aren't loud at all. They're quiet decisions, clear boundaries, and the kind of action that speaks without ever raising its voice. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't give away control of something you've spent years building, whether that's a business, your time, or your place in someone's life, without knowing exactly what you're handing over. And if you ever find yourself being treated like you don't belong, pay attention to that, because that feeling usually comes from somewhere real. If stories like this resonate with you, real grounded family revenge stories, quiet revenge stories, and honest family drama that actually happens in real life, then take a moment to subscribe. This channel is about the stories people don't always say out loud, but never forget. And sometimes hearing them is the first step to seeing your own situation a little more clearly.